They're going live. There we are.
It's live.
There we go. Awesome. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. If you saw our last live with Ali, where we talked a little bit about the drop-in center and what it took to make it happen, for this hour or less, or however long it takes, we got Kaity accompanying us, and we will be talking about sexual violence in the LGBTQIA community. LGBTQIA members face higher rates of poverty and stigma and marginalization, which tends to put them at greater risk for sexual assault. And they also face higher rates of hate motivated violence, the which can often take forms of sexual assault. And their community tends to also be hypersexualized, and their relationships can be stigmatized, which can lead to partner violence that can stem from internalized homophobia and shame, as well as like receiving that from people from the outside. So I will let Kaity take the lead, as she is much more well versed with sexual violence in the community. So please go ahead, Kaity, and educate us.
Well, thank you. There is a lot to unpack in everything that you've shared already, so I appreciate you setting the stage that way.
Yes.
Sexual violence in the LGBTQIA plus community is definitely a pressing issue, and one that we do not talk about enough for a lot of different reasons, right?
Yeah.
Number one, just as a society, we're profoundly uncomfortable talking about the intersections of sex and violence, or sex more broadly. And the LGBTQIA community is not immune from that. Number two, we do know that historically, LGBT individuals have also faced greater stigmatization for the ways that they might practice sexuality.
Yes.
So LGBT sex has often been framed by the majority as deviant in some ways. And there's been a lot of pushback to not feel shame for the ways that sexuality may be practiced outside of the norm. So I think in that context of having to really fight for public acknowledgement that the way we may express sexuality is healthy and good and normal.
Yeah.
There is also, it makes it more vulnerable to admit, and even within our own community, we can experience sexual violence.
Yes.
So there's a lot of things that contribute to that stigma, but we need to do better because the numbers tell us this is a real significant problem that enough people are suffering from, but not getting help with. So I always take my numbers from most things from an organization we're all very familiar with this week, the CDC.
Hey.
Yeah, because we haven't got enough shout outs on the news, have they?
Yeah, really.
But a different way we can talk about them. They have done a lot of comprehensive work around rates of sexual violence by sexual orientation. So these numbers, they're never going to be perfect. They rely on people self-identifying with different orientation categories and feeling comfortable enough to disclose to CDC researchers whether these have been their life experiences or not.
Yeah.
It also depends on people's ability to recognize and name boundary violations that may have happened in their lives.
Yeah.
That being said, some of the numbers that I often go to think about how significant an issue this is. We know that across the board, too many people are experiencing sexual violence.
Yes.
When we talk about those numbers by sexual orientation and within the LGBT community, they just get so much higher. So if we're specifically talking about rape alone, the lifetime prevalence of rape by anybody for heterosexual women is about 17%, 1 in 4-ish. For lesbians, we say about 13%. When we're talking about bisexual women, that number jumps to 46%.
Wow, that's crazy.
46% of bisexual women will experience rape.
Wow.
Those numbers get worse when we expand our definition of sexual violence, like we do at SARCC, to include sexual harassment, other forms of non-consensual touch, sexual bullying, and things like that. So when we talk about that, the numbers of victimization increase to 43% of heterosexual women, 46% of lesbian women, and a full 75% of bisexual women.
Whoa, that's a lot of numbers.
It's 3 and 4, right?
Yeah, that's crazy.
So talking just about those numbers as a start, I always think it's important to note bisexual individuals are at a very high risk for sexual violence, and it has nothing to do with themselves as individuals.
Of course.
So, I mean, you already talked about this in your intro, right? The hypersexualization of the LGBT community. Do you want to expand more on what you mean when you say that? Because I think it's really relevant to these numbers.
Yes. So I think it's such a weird dynamic that we have in our society, right? Where, um, although not, although maybe not as in big numbers now, still to a generalized public, this is a community that gets demonized. They get put down and like, this is wrong, you shouldn't do that. Yet when you look at porn, when you look at the sex industry, a lot of the top selling or top viewed videos tend to be videos that pertain to that community. You got lesbian porn, gay porn, bisexual porn, etc. And even when you look at, for example, sex work in general, we are seeing that about 56% of, for example, transgender youth are involved in the sex trade. So a lot of this community is being sexualized, and is being used for the sex industry in order to sell, in order to get views. Yet when you go into the community, when you go into everyday life, it's like, oh no, you shouldn't do that. And even without going much further, you can even like say how many people, if you're ever having like a sexual conversation with somebody, how many people are actually telling you like, oh my gosh, I would like to try having gay sex once, or lesbian sex once, or I would like to have like a threesome that would involve somebody of the same sex, etc. And it's kind of like a sexual fantasy in order to do that. Yet you go out and you're demonizing these individuals that are just living their lives. So it's crazy.
It's a weird duality, right? That we sexualize people without recognizing them as sexual agents, and people who deserve to have rights and safety and things like that. So I think that's so relevant for when we look at who is most vulnerable to sexual victimization. I focus on women because those numbers are among the highest by orientation, but it stays the same with men. When we look at bisexual and gay men, they have about twice the rate of sexual victimization as heterosexual men. When we look at the trans community, it is a significantly higher rate as compared to cisgender individuals. And it has to do with the ways we talk about individuals and their sexuality. What I always jump to when I look at that statistic about bisexual women, those 3 in 4 who are victimized. I mean, let's be real, right? We're both humans who exist in this world. We know that stereotypes about bisexual people exist. And there are particular ways of talking about them. They might be different for bisexual women versus bisexual men versus bisexual non-binary people. But when I think about bisexual folks, like what are some of those stereotypes that come to your mind?
When it comes about bisexual folks, well, I think the most obvious one is, and unfortunately, this is a comment that I not only hear from people outside of the LGBTQIA community, but I hear it from people from the LGBTQIA community is, oh, you're not actually bisexual, right? Like you can't be, if you, for example, if you're bisexual, but you've been predominantly with people of the opposite gender, oh, you're not bisexual, or you're not gay. Or if you've been predominantly with somebody of the same gender, oh, well, no, you're just lesbian or you're just gay. I think it's this belief that there's, you can't, like bisexuality is not a thing. You're either are gay or lesbian or you are straight. You can't exist in this dome of bi. And I guess that even becomes, not to switch completely, but that also goes into pansexuals, where it's like, whoa, no, you can't even do that either. Like, so I think that's one of the most common things that I've heard, as well as, oh, you're just a sexual freak, right? Like you just love sex. You love sex so much that you can't like just pick one gender or one sex to like stick to. So you know you're out there, you know, you're unable to have healthy monogamous relationships because you're out there just having crazy sex with people. It's like no, excuse me. But those are probably some of the most common ones that I've personally heard. I'm pretty sure there's a lot more. Also, I would want to say to anybody that's watching, you guys can definitely chime in if you have any questions at any point during this live, or any comments or any experiences that you would like to share. Please feel free to do so. But yeah, so you can go ahead and continue.
Yeah, no,
Like three people
if you have
signed off.
stereotypes you want me to yell at on your behalf, like shout them out, because I love doing that. Because everything you're saying contributes to the vulnerability of people who may be bi, or thank you so much for expanding the conversation out to people who may be pan or may sexually identify in ways that the CDC didn't necessarily recognize enough to study. That's always an issue too, right? Is how do we determine which are the labels worth talking about? So the very fact that the CDC didn't talk about people who may be pan or may be fluid or any other orientation, that contributes to their vulnerability too, because we don't see them enough to talk about them. So I think both of the threads that you're picking up on, that idea, one, bisexuality is not real. Or two, if it is real, it's because you are hypersexual. They both make people more vulnerable. This exactly dates me, right? But I was a middle schooler when Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl came out. And I have to say that when I was a teen, that really informed the conversation in my high school and my middle school about what bisexuality meant. And as our prevention educator out in the community, it's not a hugely different conversation that I hear a lot. It's the idea that people perform bisexuality to be attractive to others. That bisexuality is like an accessory that you put on, something you can buy from like victoriassecret.com, I guess, that makes you more attractive rather than a valid part of you as a human being. So what I think that says about bisexual people, if we believe it's for attention, it's not a real identity, is if it's for attention, therefore, if I give you sexual attention, you must have wanted it, right? Because you're putting on this whole bisexual act, so you must want to be sexualized. As a person actually talking right now, Katie says that's not true. We know that is not true, but that's something that I've heard from people who may be sexually inappropriate with openly bi folk as a justification for their actions. And I think that idea that they're I appreciate you being frank enough to use that term, like freaks, right? Because how often do I hear that out in the community, especially in tangent with bisexuality? The idea that a person who is sexually open to multiple genders doesn't have boundaries is another very weird idea that I hear a lot.
It's very interesting and confusing just as an individual to navigate. So it's one of those things that I can only imagine somebody in the community, or even somebody that's an ally that might have a daughter, a son, or somebody that is in the community, to be able to navigate that and even have those conversations, right? Because then let's talk about, how do you have these conversations that people don't want to have about? I mean, like you mentioned at the beginning, people don't want to talk about sex in general unless it is a sexual situation, ergo porn or movies or advertisements. Like, but do we talk about sexual health? Do we even talk to, how many people actually even feel comfortable talking about their own partners about sex and their sexual experiences? So then how do we have this conversation about sexual violence and sexual assault and rape, especially inside these marginalized communities? So how would you say that you would facilitate those conversations?
I think it absolutely has to start with comfort, talking about sexuality more broadly. And especially if we want to keep young people safe and prevent sexual violence from occurring in their lives, that means it's on us as adults to basically put on our big kid pants and deal with the discomfort that we might feel around these topics. Of course, most of us haven't necessarily received any kind of formalized education around sexuality, full stop.
Yes.
And then add in sexuality that is not cisgender and heterosexual.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I can think back to my sexual education, and I was straight up taught in my school system that boys use love to get sex and girls use sex to get love.
Yeah.
And there's nothing outside of that model. There was nothing about LGBT sexual health.
Yeah.
When I go to my own doctor, right, there's the assumption made anytime I'm there that they're talking about heterosexuality with me. That's an experience for lots of people, right? So the people who would give you medical information don't even broach it. Well, so I think it's partly on community professionals to be going to trainings and just be talking to each other. And I think more than anything, talking to LGBT folk in our communities. Lived expertise is real, right? So we can always go to trainings and beef up our knowledge that way. But people live their identities more than a webinar can ever tell you.
Yeah, for sure.
Asking what are your experiences in the healthcare setting, if I'm a doctor, would be super valuable. Asking what do you wish your parents told you about this if you are parenting somebody. Those are all options with people who are open to and have expressed openness to that.
Yes.
I'm not just going to walk up to someone in my community and say, hey, I've noticed a rainbow pin on your backpack. Let me ask you some questions.
Yeah, really. Yeah. And I think something else to also recognize as to why this is an important topic, even within the sexual violence spectrum, is because I believe, and even in many states still, when you look at sexual violence laws, a lot of them will limit it to penetration, and for penetration, generally, that would designate that it would be heterosexual or even gay, but then it completely disregards this other spectrum of the community, or ergo lesbians or anybody else, even transgender, depending on the spectrum. But it's important to recognize that sex is so much wider, and it's not just heterosexual, it's not just penetration. Therefore, any type of sexual violence can include many other things that are not just penetrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we have a problem systemically responding to same-sex sexual violence with the gravity it deserves. There's a pretty common stereotype that if sexual or domestic violence is occurring in an intimate partner relationship, it is a man hurting a woman. And when we have that as our stereotype, it doesn't leave a lot of room for a woman who's reporting that her same-sex partner is harming her.
Yes.
Right? It can be the belief of responding systems that women can't hurt women. So, sorry.
Or even in that same token, that if you're a man in a same-sex relationship with another man, you can't get hurt, right? Like, it's just men taking it out. I mean, from our experience, of course, without getting into much detail, how many calls have we not gotten from male victims that are like, people don't believe me, what can I do? And it's so infuriating. Just because you're a man, suddenly you're unable to be sexually violent or experience sexual violence. That's not how it works. But yes, you are correct. It does a disservice then to all of these other individuals that find themselves in a situation where it's not heteronormative relationship. So
and so proactive conversations about gender norms and gender stereotypes are also critical to making sure LGBT survivors of sexual violence are heard and connected with the resources they need. So that does mean unpacking our ideas about who is capable of violence and who is capable of being victimized. I think it also means, in some ways, moving away from a very neat and tidy idea of justice that says there are bad people who get punished and good people who are victims. And what I mean by that is, particularly when we're talking about intimate partner violence in within a same-sex relationship, for instance, the LGBT community is often small, which means that people who may have committed sexual offenses and people who have experienced sexual offenses run in the same circle.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do with that? Right? A lot of times we want to say people who commit sexual violence are evil, bad monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does, that we don't always realize it does, is lets us off the hook for stepping in with our friends, our family members, our loved ones, our chosen community who are acting in unsafe ways.
Yes.
We can like the people who commit sexual violence. We can have trusted them. We can have had positive sexual experiences with them.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody else could not have.
Yes.
I think we need to find a way to be able to hold those truths simultaneously and not just think about responding systems and what justice means there, but how do we promote justice within communities? How do we hold people accountable even when I love them? Because I don't want to see situations where friend groups are choosing sides between somebody who committed violence and somebody who experienced violence, and maybe saying, well, I don't believe the person coming forward because I like the accused better.
Mm-hmm.
We can like people and they can still act in unsafe ways. And we need to find a way to use our relationships as a form of accountability, not to let us off the hook for holding people accountable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think with that as well, understanding our own personal biases towards certain situations, as well as understanding that other people have their own personal biases that might not always come out. I mean, I know for me personally, outside of this, so for those that might not know, I am a human trafficking victim advocate. And from the work that I've done so far, I talk and see a lot of people that when this subject is brought up, they're like, oh, but is that existing in our community? Oh, but I couldn't see this person doing it. And it's like, just because it doesn't happen to you, one, does not mean that it doesn't happen at all. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not occurring. And just because that person does not act that way towards you does not mean that that person cannot act that way towards somebody else, especially if they do have a bias that they are not aware of. Or even if they are aware of, they might do a great job at hiding it from other people and then implementing it into others. Taking it back to porn, this is what we also see a lot of, like that hardcore porn violence, right? Where we see individuals where even inside the LGBTQIA community, they might, let me reverse that. They might not identify yet as LGBTQIA, even if they might fall in that spectrum, and they have a lot of self-hate. And sometimes those individuals can express that self-hate through violence through somebody else during sex. You know, we see some individuals, whether they consider themselves part of this community or they consider themselves heterosexual, they can go and pay for sexual services and then abuse of these sex workers and get all their frustration out on these sex workers, because the sex workers in themselves, like that's a whole nother topic, but the sex workers in themselves are already at a much vulnerable state where they're probably not going to get as much help, where people are not going to believe them, and so they're an easy target. So then you see these individuals that are having trouble expressing their sexuality or their gender, coming into peace with their sexuality and their gender, then taking it out in different ways that they might not present to the general public. You know, you might not see that. So it is understanding that what you see might not be what you get, and your neighbor, your friendly neighborhood Tom that looks like he couldn't hurt a fly, could have a couple skeletons in his closet, figuratively and maybe literally. I don't know, but
yeah, I mean, hurting people hurt people, right? It's a cliche for a reason.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in, I don't know that it is a different topic, thinking about the ways in which LGBT young people especially can be coerced into sex work and the ways that that can be a sexually violent experience too. Is that something you can speak more to?
Yes. So I can say that about, okay, so let's go a little bit back. So about, and these numbers might be just a tiny bit off, so bear with me, but about 26% of LGBTQIA plus adolescents are rejected from their families. And then about 40% of them can make up the homeless population. Now, when we talk about, for example, human trafficking, about one in three of them will be recruited by a trafficker within 48 hours, right? So then that leaves about, but then when we look at the numbers, about 58% of those 40% have been sexually assaulted, right? And they're already in the streets. And then from experiences that we've had, and again, this is a little bit more towards human trafficking, just because that's a bit more of my area of expertise. But a lot of the times, how we see this, for example, with boys, they'll be in groups. So, especially if they're younger, they'll form groups and they'll watch each other while they do those sexual acts. Or they'll coerce each other into doing those sexual acts, but they'll be together. So, when you don't have support in general, but especially you don't have a safe home or space, you are pushed to things that you maybe wouldn't have done originally. So we see it a lot, especially with kids that are finding themselves homeless. And we'll talk more about this at like 6 p.m. when we talk about homelessness in general. But you'll see it a lot in these individuals that, you know, we'll be talking about survival sex. So how do they get these resources that they need to survive when they don't have anybody to help them, or they don't have the resources themselves? And a lot of them do end up doing sex work, or just being recruited by a trafficker that will use them and will abuse them and will get them addicted to drugs just to control them. So yeah, it's not, I guess, in the general spectrum, it's really not that far off, because then you'll find that a lot of these individuals, again, about 56% of transgender are in sex work. So, and a lot of these individuals, just this is how they get to survive when they're in a society or community that does not support them and that tell them that they are not worth anything, worth living, or worth a space, or worth a voice. So
yeah, and I think it's important that we know that that's not just messaging. That's really clear policies that act as push factors when it comes to commercial sex work. So when we think about the fact that there is no guaranteed housing protection in the United States for LGBT individuals, they can absolutely legally be denied these things. Or when we're talking about that there are no guaranteed job protections, these are things that make people more financially precarious, and we need money to survive. That's the world we live in. So that term you use, survival sex, that's so apt, because people do things when they need to live.
Yeah.
Full stop. And unfortunately, there's a whole market in this world designed to take advantage of people's vulnerability and desperation to survive.
Yeah. And I think something that's also really important to mention is that a lot of these numbers also skyrocket when we're talking about the POC population. So when we're talking about people of color, and they're inside these, they're a stigmatized group inside an already stigmatized group as well. These numbers are going to skyrocket even more. I don't know if you have any more information on that you can share with us.
Oh, man. I mean, bad is what I would say, number one. Yeah. When we talk about any kind of sexual violence, we know that all people can experience sexual violence. That's fact. And we know that socially marginalized identities, socially marginalized individuals just experience it more frequently over their lifetime. So we know that LGBT individuals are at a higher risk than heterosexual cisgender people. When you add on the layer of being a person of color versus a white person, that adds greater vulnerability. If you add on disability versus somebody being able-bodied, that makes somebody more vulnerable. And again, not for anything inherent to that person. It's because we don't necessarily have systems in place that value and protect those lives. So when I push somebody into a place where they don't have money, we know that there are economically discriminatory practices against LGBT folk. There are economically discriminatory practices against people of color. Put them together, that's just double the vulnerability and double the risk of violence. Or if we say that so many people are experiencing discrimination and lack of support in their school system because they're LGBT. That is also the experience of students of color, right? So if I label those two together, or if I lump those two together, and somebody is that much more without caring supportive adults in their school system and a school system that wants them to attain further education, well, that makes sense as a push factor as well. So do I have specific numbers in front of me right now? No.
I actually do, so I can.
Do
Yes. So I was looking them up. So these are taken from the Human Rights Campaign. And it's talking, so among people of color, about 65% of American Indian, 59% of multiracial, 58% of Middle Eastern, and 53% of Black American responded. These are specifically though for U.S. transgender, but those are the numbers that are most likely to have been sexually assaulted in their lifetime. So again, let me just put that into a better sentence. So most likely to have been sexually assaulted in their lifetime, we have around 65% of American Indian, 59% of multiracial, 58% of Middle Eastern, and 53% of Black American transgender individuals. And again, this was taken from the Human Rights Campaign. So,
about
a couple of numbers in there. Yeah, so really high, more than half for all of them. It's ridiculous. It's crazy.
Yeah. And then if you add factors like incarceration onto this too, there's an organization called Black and Pink that specifically advocates on behalf of incarcerated queer people of color.
Yes.
Great organization. They did a research study a few years ago indicating that as many as 96 to 99% of incarcerated trans folk of color have experienced sexual violence while they have been in the prison system.
Yeah.
I want to repeat that number because numbers can get boring. They can go in one year, one out the other. Hear this number, 96 to 99%. That's too many. What that means is there are systems that are also just routinely manufacturing trauma on the basis of queer identity, on the basis of racial identity, on the basis of gender. We know that those are just places that are not safe. And those are, again, places that we can intervene with policy. So I always appreciate us talking about the community level and what can we each be doing, which is educate yourself, talk to the people in your lives who are willing to speak to you. But there's more that we need to do, right? Me knowing anything, me being the wokest of the woke, changes nothing unless I am using my voice to advocate for policies, procedures, and change in the lives of individuals who need it. So when we're looking at policies that enable sexual violence to occur at higher rates against queer incarcerated people of color, how can we change that? What policies exist that we can do that? When we're looking at those financial push factors, how can we eliminate that material vulnerability? We need to be also looking at those. And great resources to be following regularly are like the Human Rights Campaign that you just spotlighted. They do a great job of rounding up relevant political issues to look at and just advocate on behalf of people's lives. So that's not about party line, that's about people and people deserving protection.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who agrees that sexual violence is not okay agrees that it shouldn't happen to anybody for any reason. These are just reasons that we know exist, reasons we know shouldn't exist, and reasons we can work together to collectively eliminate.
Yeah, and I think that's where it starts. It's realizing that one way or another, at one point in our lives, we have all contributed to how things are now. But the same way that we did that, we have the opportunity of contributing towards change and towards, funding these more accepting and better educated organizations and better resources for all of us. Because if the most vulnerable is taken care of, we're all taken care of. And that's actually a quote that I remember from Kaity's class when she taught us. So
it's cribbed, it's fine.
but yes, I think it starts with us. It starts with realizing what are our biases, and being honest with yourself. And you don't owe it to anybody else, but I think at the very end of the day, we owe it to ourselves to be honest with ourselves and understand what are my biases and why do I have these biases. How can I change this? Is this something that I can change? And then going out there and educating yourself. We don't all know everything, and it's a constant changing world. Um, and even inside the community, like LGBTQIA plus community, there's a plus for a reason because things keep being added. And as more educated as we become, we start to realize and understand all of these other factors within the spectrum. So, it's okay if, as an ally or as somebody inside the community, you don't understand everything. That's fine. But, try to educate yourself. And at the very least, be respectful. And if you don't understand anything, just be respectful. You don't understand it, that's fine. Try to educate yourself. I will, before we start wrapping up. So I found this little, again, from the Human Rights Campaign, and it says that about 85%, so 85% of victim advocates surveyed by the NCAVP reported having worked with an LGBTQIA plus survivor who was denied services because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So the 2015 transgender survey found that 1 in 5, so about 20% of respondents who were incarcerated in jail, prison, or juvenile detention in the past year has been sexually assaulted by a facility staff during that time. Additionally, 17% of respondents who stayed at one or more homeless shelters in the past year were sexually assaulted at the shelter because they were transgender. But let me just repeat this number again. 85% of victim advocates surveyed by the NCAVP reported having worked with an LGBTQIA plus individual survivor who was denied services because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Nobody should ever be denied services for their sexual orientation or gender identity, especially somebody that is in need, somebody that is vulnerable, somebody that has been a victim of our system and just society as a whole. That is ridiculous. So, as we continue thinking about what we can do, again, Kaity mentioned some very, very great things. Focus on policy. What can we change? But at the same time, what are your biases? How can you learn? Other things, volunteer with programs around your community. If there's a program that you don't see that there's a need for, find a way to start it, and find support around your community. But, at the very end, I think that we are responsible for educating ourselves and understanding these things and understanding all of these changes that are coming into our community. So once again, do you have anything else that you would like to add, Kaity? Any other numbers or any other comments that you would like to speak about?
I think just one more thing that I want to remind anybody in our community of is it is all of our responsibility to learn about and show up for one another, but you're not alone in doing that work. It can feel daunting, right? To hear the extent to which sexual violence can saturate a community and feel very helpless to do anything about it. You're not. You have a ton of power to make sure everyone around us is safer, but SARCC is here to help you unlock and use that power effectively. So I know I speak for you, Yesi. I know I speak for myself. I speak for everybody at SARCC. Whatever it is you do in your life professionally, in terms of your faith community, in terms of your extracurriculars, whatever it is you do, we will show up and help you figure out a plan to make sure the most vulnerable among us are safer. So if that's looking at policies for a homeless shelter that is run by your faith group, reach out to us and we will help you figure out how to be addressing sexual violence and LGBTQIA plus inclusivity with those programs. if that is your school that you're looking to support students who are experiencing sexual violence and do identify as LGBT+, reach out to us and we will let you know how to do that. We all need to work together to build our capacity to show up for our community. But SARCC is here to help you do that in whatever way you need. So please reach out. We're real free. We're really happy to be very free right now. We're real free. Yes. And if you need us to do it via Zoom or Skype or any such thing for reasons that I don't want to mention today because I've been thinking about it too much already. We're flexible. We're there for you, whatever way you need us to be.
Yes. So we'll try. Okay, so we're gonna wrap this one up. Thank you so much for everybody that was present or that will see this in the future. We do want to remind you that at 5, Kaity will be joining us again, but we'll be talking about mental illness, and then at 6, we're gonna be speaking with Amari, and we'll be talking about homelessness in the LGBTQIA+ community. Again, if you guys have any questions or want to reach us or anything, you can send us questions through the live. You can send us questions through the chat. We do have the 24/7 hour hotline that you can reach us as well, and we're available on Facebook. So however you guys would like to reach us, but in the meantime, thank you so much, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kaity.